If you tried to find a drive-in movie theater today, you could still find one, but you might have to drive an hour or two to get there. In many towns, they're completely gone. The giant outdoor screens, the rows of cars lined up at dusk, the glow of brake lights flickering across a gravel lot. For most Americans, that world has almost entirely disappeared. In 1958, there were over 4,000 drive-in theaters operating across the United States. Today, only a small fraction remain. The reason seems simple. Indoor theaters are more convenient. Home streaming is easier. Real estate is more valuable. But that explanation only tells you how they ended. It doesn't explain how they once became such a central part of American life. For a few decades in the middle of the 20th century, the drive-in wasn't a novelty. It was normal. It was expected. On summer nights, especially in small towns and growing suburbs, the drive-in was where people went. This is the story of how that world worked back then, and why it faded away. You see, by the late 1950s, drive-ins were everywhere, along highways, on the edges of town, just beyond new housing developments that seemed to stretch further each year. A typical evening followed a familiar rhythm. As the sun began to drop, families loaded into station wagons. Teenagers borrowed the car. Couples planned their night around showtimes that began after dark, when the sky was just dim enough for the screen to glow. You'd pull into a wide gravel lot and stop at a small booth to pay. An attendant might hand you a printed schedule. You'd drive slowly between metal poles topped with small speakers, each one hanging from a hook. The speaker cord would stretch just far enough to clip onto the edge of your rolled-down window. When the movie started, you'd hear the faint crackle of sound through that little box. Not perfect, but good enough. Children often arrived in pajamas. Some fell asleep in the back seat before the second feature ended. The concession stand, usually positioned beneath the screen or near the center of the lot, glowed under fluorescent lights. The smell of popcorn drifted through warm night air. In some places, there was a small playground beneath the screen, where kids played until the opening credits rolled. The experience wasn't just about watching a movie. It was about space. You were in your own car, but you were also part of a crowd. Hundreds of families and couples facing the same screen, engines ticking quietly as they cooled, radios humming softly, headlights briefly flashing as someone adjusted their position. On a warm July night, sitting in a car surrounded by hundreds of others, you were alone and together at the same time. That balance is harder to find now. The drive-in thrived because it fit the moment America was living in. After World War II, the country experienced an explosion of suburban growth. Car ownership rose rapidly. Highways expanded. Land outside city centers was cheap and plentiful. The drive-in was perfectly designed for a nation reorganizing itself around the automobile. Building one wasn't as expensive as constructing a downtown movie palace. You needed land, a large screen structure, a projection booth, and basic concessions. The overhead was manageable, especially when the land itself cost relatively little. And because families stayed in their cars, staffing needs were modest compared to indoor theaters. For families with young children, it solved a problem. You didn't have to hire a babysitter. If a child cried, you could manage it without disturbing strangers. Teenagers gained something else entirely: privacy within limits. The drive-in became woven into American dating culture. It appeared in films, in advertisements, in the collective imagination. By 1970, drive-ins were at their peak. But the seeds of their decline had already been planted. The entire economic logic of the drive-in rested on two quiet assumptions. First, land on the outskirts of town would remain inexpensive. Second, audiences would continue to treat the car as their primary entertainment space. For a time, both assumptions held. Then two forces collided that the drive-in model couldn't survive. The first was rising land value. As suburbs expanded, the land that once sat at the edge of town no longer felt remote. Shopping centers, apartment complexes, and retail developments moved outward. Property values climbed. The same large parcels of land that once made sense for a seasonal theater began to look more valuable as commercial development. A drive-in requires enormous acreage, hundreds of parking spaces, clear sight lines, distance from streetlights. When land prices rise high enough, the math changes. A developer can generate more consistent, year-round revenue from retail or housing than from a business dependent on clear summer evenings. The second shift came from inside the movie industry itself. Indoor multiplex theaters began to replace single-screen cinemas. Instead of one large auditorium, developers built complexes with 6, 8, or 12 smaller screens. This allowed theaters to show multiple films simultaneously, rotate underperforming titles quickly, and maximize attendance regardless of weather. Weather had always been a vulnerability for drive-ins. Rain could cancel an evening entirely. Cold temperatures shortened the season in northern states. Wind could distort sound. A multiplex eliminated those variables. Then came the quiet technological change that further undercut the drive-in's advantage: home video. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, VHS players entered American homes. For the first time, families could rent a movie and watch it on their own television, on their own schedule. The drive-in had once offered privacy and convenience compared to downtown theaters. Now, the living room offered even more. Through the 1980s and 1990s, closures accelerated. Some drive-ins attempted to adapt. A few upgraded their sound systems to broadcast through FM radio rather than window-mounted speakers. Others leaned into nostalgia or niche markets, but the larger trend was difficult to reverse. As attendance fell, maintenance became harder to justify. Projection equipment needed upgrades, screens required repair, concession revenue fluctuated, and all the while, the land beneath the theater continued to appreciate in value. By the early 2000s, the numbers had dwindled dramatically. But like the TV repair shop, the disappearance of the drive-in wasn't purely economic. It reflected a broader change in how Americans used shared space. The drive-in was a hybrid environment. You were together, but separate. Public, yet private. It allowed for a kind of collective experience without full participation in a crowd. That balance suited a particular era, one defined by car culture, slower evenings, and fewer entertainment options. As entertainment fragmented, so did attention. Cable television multiplied channels. The internet expanded choices. Streaming eliminated schedules entirely. The shared ritual of showing up at the same place, at the same time, for the same film, became less central to daily life. There's also a seasonal quality to drive-ins that doesn't translate easily to a 24-hour climate-controlled world. They belong to summer, to dusk, to warm nights with the windows cracked open. Modern entertainment, by contrast, is designed for consistency. It works in January as well as July. It works in rain or snow. It requires no coordination with sunset. Something else changed as well: the car itself. In the 1950s and 60s, cars were spacious, bench-seated, built for lingering. Families could sit comfortably for hours. Over time, vehicle design shifted. Compact cars became common. Interiors changed. The cultural centrality of the automobile softened. The drive-in, once aligned perfectly with American habits, slowly fell out of sync with them. And yet, a few remain. Some operate as seasonal attractions, drawing crowds precisely because they feel different. Others survive in rural areas where land remains affordable and communities support them intentionally. The question isn't whether their decline was inevitable. Given rising land values, shifting technology, and changing consumer behavior, it probably was. But understanding why they flourished helps explain something about the world that produced them. They thrived in a moment of expansion, when space felt abundant, cars felt central, and shared rituals structured weekends. They faded in a period defined by efficiency, density, and individual choice. What disappeared wasn't just an outdoor screen. It was a particular arrangement of time and space. An evening that required planning, waiting, patience. Today, watching a movie rarely requires leaving the house. The image is sharper, the sound is clearer, the choice is nearly infinite. But the experience is different. If you remember sitting in the back seat, the speaker crackling slightly as the first scene flickered to life, or waiting in line at the concession stand while the sky darkened overhead, you were part of something that made sense in its time. Drive-in theaters are mostly gone. but the fact that they once felt essential tells you something about the era that built them, and about the world that gradually replaced them. If you remember going to a drive-in, I'd be interested to hear what it was like where you lived. Was it a family ritual? A teenage hangout? Did your town still have one when you were growing up? And if you find these kinds of stories worth exploring, subscribing lets me know there's interest in looking back at the everyday spaces that quietly shaped how people lived. The drive-in may have faded from most highways, but understanding why it rose and why it declined helps make sense of the broader shift from a culture built around shared public evenings to one organized around private screens.